right, so what does good research involve in terms of components? Let's talk first about large sample size. A sample is a little bit like money. You could always have more, so you always want to make sure you've got a decent sized sample. Something to keep in mind though is the size of the population you're drawing from. So for example, if I was to say, if my sample if I was sampling women, right, for example, I could get a large sample because obviously half of the population of this planet is female. But if I was taking more of a nuanced sample of a smaller group, for example, females who live in a certain state and vote a certain way, right? That's going to be a smaller sample, so the sample size will ultimately be smaller as well in proportion, right? Random selection, of course, we talked about this on the last slide. Ideally, if it's there, if it's possible, that would be great, just because it reduces bias. Once again, random assignment as well, for the exact same reason. You reduce bias when you reduce those sort of things. Pilot testing is something we haven't discussed yet, but pilot testing is really just as it sounds. You're actually taking the study and deploying it in a small fashion first before you roll it out to the larger full study, as it were, right? So it's kind of like taste testing. It's a dry run. It's just making sure that what you've designed works well, and ideally taking the feedback and kind of reintegrating in the study and adapting the study a little bit so it could be better when it's fully launched. Obviously, you want this to be based on strong theory, so that's really the foundation on which you build your house of research. We want an unbiased design. Maybe I would put unbiased in quotes because we can't really get a fully unbiased design. That should be like our goal, but it's never achievable. So, for example, we're called to lead a Christ-like life. Can we ever truly be just like Christ? Absolutely not, because we're limited by our human nature and the fact that we're not God's son, as it were. So we should strive for it, but we can't achieve it, but still striving, all right? Thorough purposeful analysis, which we'll talk about later in the course, but we don't want to just be fishing with dynamite. We want to make sure we know what we're looking for and what we see when we see it. And then also unbiased supported conclusions. As I said, don't kind of outkick your coverage, as it were. Make sure that your conclusions line up with your results and you are not putting too much subjectivity into it. So, as we talked about in the beginning of this chapter, is I want you to consider science and religion. And many people see them as oppositional. For example, alien life, right? If you want to think of the idea of extraterrestrial life, you can look at these different objects here in this picture and say, okay, is this proof for alien life? That top left picture is actually just with a wisp of clouds. Top right picture is actually a small mountain that's shot on an angle, so it's got a shadow like this. The skull in the middle is actually part of a tribe that used to actually bind their skulls from birth so that they would actually grow backwards. So that's actually a human, not alien. Bottom left is Egyptian hieroglyphs of the god Ra. So once again, part of their religious structure. And then bottom right isn't actually any kind of alien event. It's actually some drunken farmers out in England having a good time after having spent too much time at the pub. Right? Likewise, if we look at the proof for the existence of God, right, people will turn to the Shroud of Turin, which I would invite you to view, by the way. The Shroud of Turin is not a small piece of cloth. It's actually like 20 feet long, and the face of Christ in it actually is a very small portion of it, or the appearance of the face of Christ. But people say, I saw Jesus Christ on my toast this morning, or the Virgin Mary. Many of us would even point to the Bible and say, that is proof that God exists. But I think when we're looking, if we're seeking proof, I think we're seeking the wrong thing, obviously. When we talk about faith, faith is believing in the absence of proof, right? So much of what I'm showing on these two slides has to do with what you want to believe. If you want to believe aliens exist, you're going to see things and think, that's aliens. If you want God to exist, you're going to look at things like this and say, that's God existing, right? Doesn't mean the aliens don't exist. Doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, but you're bringing a bias. So is there any scientific evidence for the existence of extraterrestrial life? Not really. Not really. In fact, if there's any evidence for the mechanism of macroevolution, it's here on Earth. We've seen it play out on this planet, but we haven't seen it play out anywhere else, right? We've only ever seen the process of evolution take place here. Is that enough to conclude that evolution is a true process? I think so. Yes, absolutely. But we haven't seen it elsewhere, right? Likewise, what is the basis for the existence of God? What we have seen play out in our own species, in our own planet, in our own backyard, right? So we've essentially got one case for the existence of God, one case for the existence for evolution, macroevolution, right? And people want to argue about it. Well, without more cases, it's really hard to say which one is right and which one's wrong. But I think in both cases, you're missing the point. It's not about which one's right and which one's wrong. It's about how they look at the big picture. Which ones fit the data that we have, right? And as both a scientist and a Christian, I feel like both fit the data very, very well. And my worldview is actually a blend of the two. I'm very much Christian. I very much identify God as my creator and Christ as my savior. But I also believe that evolution, macroevolution, is a mechanism of creation utilized by God, right? But you see what I'm doing there? I'm taking what I know and I'm trying to meld the information in a way that fits from what I know. So, what is the problem? Of course, the both religion and science are essentially trying to do the same thing: prove the unprovable. Right? We're trying to establish something as done and finite. It exists or it doesn't, or it does do this or doesn't do that, simply based on what we know. We cannot prove or unprove anything. Essentially, we have the same dilemma. As I said earlier, research is not trying to shut the book on anything. We're essentially trying to explore the topic further. So we're providing support for an existing, research structure or a theory or hypothesis or perspective or whatever, right? So we shouldn't ever be seeking proof. And I would argue, from a Christian worldview, I don't think we should ever be seeking proof either. Our faith should be sufficient as we follow God. Faith, proof to me is completely necessary. And this is kind of a paraphrase of a quote from Albert Einstein. Basically, a single study cannot discount the validity of a theory, but must be considered rationally in conjunction with the existing evidence. So he said basically, if there's 100 studies that show that I'm right, and only one study that shows that I'm wrong, I have to accept the possibility that I'm wrong. Right? Not that you are necessarily wrong, but you have to accept that there's a possibility that you are wrong, even though there's 100 pieces of evidence to indicate you're not. One denotes that you are or could possibly be, and you must acknowledge that, right? That's what we're talking about. Plausible rival hypotheses, as we talked about earlier in this lecture. Okay? So parsimony, as I said, really frustrating. The simplest explanation is the best, right? The simplest explanation is often the easiest to accept and understand. If you're taking notes, I would underline the last 5 words of that statement. Easiest to accept and understand. I think this is why people tend to be parsimonious. It's the easiest thing to wrap our little brains around in ways that don't violate our structures or violate our thought process. It basically is convenient, acceptable, comfortable, might be a good way to look at it, right? But this is the caveat to me. This is the problem, is obviously the simplest explanation is still going to be flawed by the fact that it is simple. And if you look at human beings, there's not an aspect of human beings that is simple. The way we think, the way we operate, our physical form, none of it is simple. And that's why I think parsimony is not the way to go, particularly with a social science. Actually, I don't think it's the best way to go with a hard science, but I think with social science in particular, you cannot just simply say human beings are linear. Because if you've ever been around a human being or been a human being yourself, you'll understand that, of course, we're not linear. Our behavior is almost arbitrary, right? A mystery to everyone but God. So parsimony too. If we look at parsimony, if we apply parsimony to what we know about human existence, right? What is the most parsimonious explanation for the existence of the universe? God doesn't exist, right? We are alone. We're essentially the endpoint, or far down the line of billions of years of evolution, 14 to be precise, right? And essentially, our planet has won tons of cosmic lotteries to allow it to sustain life, and here we are. Here we are, right? What I find frustrating about these is I don't find any of those to be simple in my mind, right? I don't know, and this is once again my bias, but I have a hard time looking at everything that around us and the majesty of creation and thinking, well, that was just the result of many, 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 many lucky chances over the course of the last 14 billion years, right? Simple, yes, but if you take even a moment to look at it in more detail, really? And as I said before, the problem is we have to look beyond what the parsimonious explanation is. Something I like to point out to my students, one of the areas I study a lot actually is mass shootings, which I know is depressing and upsetting, but one of the things I point out to my students is the single best predictor of whether or not someone will be a mass shooter is biological sex. Mass shooters, as a overwhelming majority, are male, right? Another good predictor, top 3. The other 2 in the top 3, male, young, white. right? Those are arguably, in most estimations, most regression equations, going to be the three strongest predictors for whether or not someone will be a mass shooter, right? The problem with that is if you were to take all young white males and hide them away just to make sure they don't become mass shooters, you see the problem you're developing here. The simplest explanation might be, okay, well, we'll just separate them, right? And you might have seen this. Some of my older students, or excuse me, more mature students who are hearing this lecture might remember the massive rate of Islamophobia that took place shortly following 9/11, right? And of course, there were people on do not fly lists, and there were random TSA checks that seemed to really center on people that were of darker complexion and beards. Unfortunately, a lot of Sikh individuals got thrown into that mix as well because many people don't know the difference between Muslims and Sikhs, right? But all this to say, the simplest explanation for many people was, okay, it's that group. That group is the one that did this. And in that group, they weren't talking about terrorists. They weren't talking about fundamentalists. They simply made that group into Muslims, right? The Islamic community suddenly became that group. That is a parsimonious explanation for what happened. And I hope you hear the sarcasm in my voice because you understand that's a terrible explanation for what happened. Muslims as a group are not a threat to us or to anybody any more than a Christian group would be a threat, right? But terrorists, fundamentalists of any nature, of course, present a threat. So my problem with parsimony, as you've probably already gathered, is that it's simply too simple. That's a redundant thing to say. It is far too simple to account for what we really need to explore. And in my mind, it tends to blur, or not blur, kind of block out our vision. If you think of the blinders you put on horses, right? This is how we see things. Why? Because if we see all of this here, we'll get confused and scared. We have to be willing to take those blinders off and be willing to accept that there's possibilities that surround us in all directions, and we have to think through those, utilizing the data, the previous research, and of course, the logic and reason that were gifted to us by the Lord above.